Ollie, don't worry. I will definitely find your biological parents and reunite you with them. The searing pain of being burned alive had not yet faded, but the familiar voice by my ear jolted me awake. Ethan still hadn't noticed anything strange about me. He held my hand gently and asked, "By the way, did your parents leave you any keepsake?" The nightmares of my previous life flooded back into my mind. I looked up at the young Ethan in front of me, shock and disbelief coursing through me. I had returned to 10 years ago. Seeing my lack of response, Ethan's tone turned slightly impatient. "Ollie, did you hear me?" A surge of overwhelming hatred churned inside my chest. Every part of my body ached as if the pain of my past life had followed me here. I abruptly pulled my hand away from Ethan's grasp, struggling to suppress the urge to kill him on the spot. "What keepsake? What nonsense are you talking about?" I forced my voice to remain steady, though the rage within me threatened to break free. Feeling an unbearable discomfort, I quickly excused myself. "I'm not feeling well. I need to go." Not waiting Ethan's response, I turned and ran. I sprinted as fast as I could, only stopping when I reached a large tree. Leaning against it for support, I looked down at my smooth, unscarred hands. Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. There were no scars from years of torment, no broken, disfigured fingers, no face marred by burns. Heaven had finally given me a second chance. In my past life, I had been separated from my parents at a young age. To find them, I had given everything to Ethan. Yet, all I received in return was 10 years of injustice and a body crippled beyond repair. Ethan had stolen my jade pendant and let his beloved white moonlight, Jessica, assume my identity, stealing the life that rightfully belonged to me. When I finally tried to expose the truth, Ethan silenced me. He cut my vocal cords, broke my hands, and burned me alive in an abandoned warehouse. But now, given this second chance at life, I would never let my identity be taken again. I would make sure Ethan and Jessica met a fate worse than death. Wiping away my tears, I ran straight to the brigade office, determined to reclaim my work points. But the response crushed my hopes. "The points have already been converted for city residency. You can only make changes for future ones." Realizing there was no way to stop Ethan from returning to the city, I swallowed my frustration and forced myself to remain calm. Uncle Martin from the brigade noticed my expression and tried to console me. "Ollie, don't dwell on it. Jessica is said to be Zach's cousin. There's no need to make a fuss over this." My expression darkened instantly. In my past life, Ethan had been afraid I would uncover his relationship with Jessica, so he had kept her in a neighboring village. But why, in this life, had he brought her here the moment I refused to hand over my keepsake? A deep sense of unease settled in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm and hurried home. As soon as I reached the door, I saw two familiar figures inside. Ethan stood beside Jessica, while my adoptive parents, Robert and Linda, beamed with joy. Seeing me at the entrance, Linda was the first to speak. "You're just in time," she said with a smile. "Since Jessica is new to the village and there's no extra space, she'll be staying with you. Take good care of her, okay?" Ethan stepped forward, putting on his usual gentle act. "Allie, you know I'll be leaving for the city soon. Jessica is my cousin, and she's not in good health. I'm counting on you to look after her." Watching Ethan pretend to be so considerate made my stomach churn with disgust. In my past life, he had used this very excuse to control me, forcing me to endure Jessica's endless mistreatment. Because she was his cousin, I had tolerated it all. It wasn't until my dying breath that I learned the truth. Jessica was never his cousin. She was the woman Ethan had loved for years. Because of their differences in social status, they couldn't be together. So when he discovered my real identity, he deliberately approached me, stole my keepsake, and let Jessica assume my place. I clenched my fists, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "We had a deal. I'd help you get back to the city, and you'd help me find my parents. Since when do I owe you anything?" My gaze sharpened as I continued. "There's a designated dormitory for educated youths. Has Jessica suddenly become too good for those conditions after just a few years in the countryside?" At my words, both Ethan and Jessica's faces turned dark. "Ollie, what nonsense are you spouting?" Ethan snapped. In this era, seeking comfort or special treatment was a grave mistake. If such a label was placed on someone, not only would public criticism be inevitable, but returning to the city would become nothing more than a distant dream. Robert's face twisted with anger as he scolded me. "How dare you? Ethan is speaking to you nicely, yet you act so high and mighty. Do you really think this house belongs to you? Don't forget, without our family, you would have died long ago." I let out a cold laugh, straightening my back as I met his glare. "And why wouldn't this house be mine? This place was given to us by Grandma Shen out of gratitude after I saved her life. You're only enjoying this roof over your head because of me." I took a step forward, my voice sharp as a blade. "And I've heard plenty from the neighbors. When you took me in, I still had a piece of gold on me. Without that gold, you all would have starved to death." My gaze swept over their stunned faces, and the burning hatred in my heart only intensified. In my previous life, my so-called family had hidden these truths from me. I had been burdened by the weight of false gratitude, forced to endure their exploitation. But in this life, I would only focus on reclaiming what was mine. Jessica hadn't expected this sudden outburst from me, the once obedient, submissive girl she had known. Even Robert seemed uneasy. His only concern in life was his son, Daniel, and he clearly didn't want to risk his future over something as trivial as accommodating Jessica. I had no time to care about their reactions. My voice turned cold and unwavering. "Let me make myself clear. If anyone dares to put her in my room, don't blame me for being ruthless." Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and stormed back into my room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know how they ended up resolving it, but in the end, Robert begrudgingly cleared out a small storage room for Jessica to stay in. If she was willing to endure hardship, I had no reason to care. At dawn the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, I slipped into the city. I remembered from my past life that my parents had been searching for me, spreading my information to every police station they could. And Ethan's uncle just so happened to be the police chief. That was likely how Ethan had learned about the keepsake in the first place. Thinking back to my wrongful imprisonment, framed for theft, I was now almost certain that Ethan had a hand in it as well. My fists clenched as I stood at a crossroad, staring at two different paths before me. Then, without hesitation, I turned and headed toward the Shen family's residence. 4 years ago, I had saved Grandma Shen's life. She had once told me that if I ever needed help, I could turn to her. But in my past life, I had been brainwashed by my adoptive family, unwilling to seek her aid, which cost me my only lifeline. Arriving at the Shen family's door, I took a deep breath and knocked. The door opened, revealing a young man with a strong, well-built frame. His voice was firm yet familiar. "Who's there?" I stood frozen, my mind blank for a moment before I stammered, My name is Ollie Smith." At the mention of my name, the man's furrowed brows relaxed, and his expression softened in a way that didn't match his imposing stature. "Ollie? Grandma has mentioned you before. I'm Zachary Shen. Come on in." Zachary Shen. I stared at him in shock, memories flooding my mind. In my past life, when I was burned alive in the warehouse, someone had tried to save me. I remembered the roaring flames, the searing pain as my vocal cords had been cut, rendering me voiceless. My limbs had been broken, leaving me unable to move. In desperation, I had slammed my head against a nearby barrel, knocking it over. Through the flickering firelight, I had seen a silhouette rushing toward me. Someone had shouted behind him, "Captain Shen, you're imagining things. It's just an abandoned warehouse. No one could be in there." But he hadn't believed them. He had tried again and again to break through the flames. In my final moments, I had felt someone's presence beside me, a voice urgently calling out, "Don't be afraid." And now, that voice aligned perfectly with the man standing before me. Could it really be him? I followed Zachary inside like a ghost drifting through memories, unable to process my thoughts. It wasn't until Grandma Shen spoke that I snapped out of my daze. "Grandma Shen," I said, my voice steadying, "I need to ask for your help." I took out the keepsake, carefully explaining my real identity and my search for my parents. I couldn't afford to make the same mistakes again. I didn't mention my parents' identities. Beside me, Zachary looked puzzled. "If you're looking for your family, shouldn't you be going to the police? Why are you asking my grandmother for help?" For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. My original reason for coming here was because of the rumors. I had heard that Grandma Shen had connections with influential people, But as for why I wasn't going to the police, I couldn't explain that just yet. Seeing my hesitation, Grandma Shen simply patted my hand with a kind smile. "It's all right, Zach. Leave this matter to me. It's getting late. Why don't you escort Allie back home?" Hearing her agree to help, I quickly expressed my gratitude and waved my hands. No need, I can go back on my own." But before I could finish speaking, Zachary had already stood up and walked toward the door. "Allie, ensuring people's safety is our duty as soldiers. Let's go. I'll take you home." The memories of my past life flashed through my mind, the moment before my death, when someone had tried to save me from the fire. The words I was about to say caught in my throat, and I silently followed behind Zachary. I walked in a daze, staring at his back, lost in thought. Before I knew it, we had reached the village. Just as I turned to bid him farewell, a furious voice rang out behind me. "Allie Smith, no wonder you wanted to change your work points. You've found yourself a wild man." I turned to see Ethan standing there with Jessica by his side. A cold smirk spread across my face. "What, did you eat shit or something? Your mouth reeks. Trying to smear me, huh? Aren't you afraid I'll report you for improper relations?" My eyes narrowed as I added, "So tell me, Jessica, is that what you really are? Just Ethan's cousin?" At my words, Ethan and Jessica both paled, their composure breaking. Without another word, they hurriedly made up an excuse and fled. I had just let out a sigh of relief when a quiet chuckle sounded beside me. I turned sharply and Zachary raised his hands apologetically. "No offense, I just didn't expect you to be this sharp-tongued. You were so quiet on the way here." I was about to respond when he suddenly handed me something. "Here, Grandma asked me to give you these food vouchers. Keep them safe." His expression turned serious. "Those two don't seem like good people. Watch yourself. If anything happens, come find me at the Shen family's house." With that, he waved and walked off without another word. I looked down at the food vouchers in my hand, warmth unexpectedly filling my chest. Determined to keep my jade pendant away from Ethan, I had sewn a secret pocket inside my clothes and hidden it there. But Jessica had been lurking around my room lately, her eyes full of suspicion. Each time I returned, there were signs that someone had been searching through my things. I pretended not to notice, not wanting to stir up more trouble. Ethan, on the other hand, was growing visibly anxious. He had abandoned his usual distant attitude and started acting overly friendly toward me, much to Jessica's displeasure. However, his pride kept him from begging outright. After a few sarcastic remarks from me, he stopped approaching altogether. Meanwhile, Grandma Shen had finally brought me some good news. My parents had learned of my whereabouts. However, for now, they could only send someone else to retrieve me. The thought of finally changing my fate filled me with excitement. Every day, I anxiously awaited the arrival of the person who would take me away from Dayan village. Then, one night, exhausted from anticipation, I fell into a deep sleep. When I opened my eyes, I found my hands and feet tightly bound. My jade pendant, which I had carefully hidden, was now clutched in Ethan's hands. My eyes widened in horror. "Give me back my pendant." Jessica casually snatched it from Ethan and waved it in front of me like a trophy. Allie, she sneered. "You tried so hard to protect this, but in the end, it still ended up in my hands." I gritted my teeth, hatred burning through me as I glared at the two of them. "That's my pendant. It was a gift from my parents. What right do you have to take it?" Jessica merely smirked, her eyes full of mockery. "What right?" Ethan suddenly grabbed my jaw in a bruising grip, his dark eyes glinting with cruelty. "Because Jessica needs your identity. You should just hand it over willingly. Otherwise, do you think I've been putting on this act for so long just for fun? Did you really believe I ever liked you?" Ethan's voice dripped with mockery as he continued. "Why couldn't you just play dumb? Why force me to take extreme measures?" He sneered and glanced at the jade pendant in his hand. "Your adoptive parents really have no eye for valuable things. This is an imperial-grade green jade pendant, and yet they thought it was worthless. All it took was a promise to get Daniel a job, and they were more than happy to drug you and let us in." Even though I had long known how heartless Robert and Linda could be, hearing these words still sent a sharp pain through my chest. Holding back my tears, I looked at Ethan and hissed, Aren't you afraid that my parents will find out you're using someone to impersonate me? Jessica let out a laugh, covering her mouth in amusement. Find out? As long as you never leave this village, how will they ever know? Ethan already knows everything about your past before you went missing. Combined with this jade pendant, why would they ever suspect me? I knew she wasn't lying. In my past life, they had fooled my parents for 10 whole years, maybe even for a lifetime. Hatred and resentment burned through my veins as I glared at Ethan and Jessica. You will pay for this. A loud slap cracked through the air as Ethan's hand struck my face. The searing pain stole my breath away. He looked at me coldly and smirked. By tomorrow, Jessica and I will be together, happy and free. As for you, your wonderful adoptive parents have already arranged for you to marry that crippled man from the east side of the village. With that, he wrapped an arm around Jessica's waist and strutted out of the room, leaving me alone in the freezing space. The cold wind seeped through the cracks in the window, chilling me to the bone. I struggled against the ropes binding my wrists and ankles, but they wouldn't budge. The more I thought about the fate awaiting me at dawn, the more despair crept in. Tears welled up in my eyes, but with each sob, my unwillingness to surrender only grew stronger. Heaven had given me a second chance. I could not give up. I frantically scanned the room, my eyes landing on a ceramic bowl in the corner. Without hesitation, I shifted my body toward the edge of the bed. With a heavy thud, I crashed to the floor, the impact sending sharp pain through my body. Gritting my teeth, I dragged myself toward the bowl, grasped it in my bound hands, and slammed it against the wall. The bowl shattered, leaving behind sharp ceramic shards. One by one, I picked up the fragments and began slicing through the ropes. The night outside faded into dawn, and as the first light of day streamed through the window, the last fibers of the rope finally gave way. I quickly freed myself, rubbing my sore wrists as I staggered to my feet. But the door was locked from the outside. After several failed attempts to break it down, I turned my gaze to the window. Without hesitation, I grabbed the heavy chair in the room and hurled it at the glass. The sound of shattering echoed through the air. Just as I was about to climb out, I heard movement outside the door. My heart pounded as I quickly slipped through the broken window and ran. Behind me, Robert and Linda's furious shouts rang out. Ignoring them, I sprinted toward the center of the village. Finally, I spotted a car parked at the entrance, and Jessica was standing by the door, her face full of excitement as she prepared to get in. Without a second thought, I shouted, "Stop!" That jade pendant in her hand was stolen from me. My sudden outburst froze everyone in place. Ethan's expression twisted in rage as he rushed toward me, clamping a hand over my mouth. "Allie, have you lost your mind?" He quickly turned to the people near the car and forced a smile. "I'm so sorry, everyone. She's just a crazy girl from the village. Her family always favored boys over girls, so she's been deluding herself into thinking she's not their real daughter. I'll take her away right now." I struggled against his grip, but before I could make a sound, Linda rushed over, nodding in agreement. Yes, I'm so sorry for the commotion. She's always been trouble. Don't mind her, we'll take her home immediately." Seeing Linda approaching, I knew I had no time to waste. I lifted my foot and kicked Ethan hard in his most vulnerable spot. He groaned in agony, doubling over as he instinctively let go of me. His face twisted in pain and fury. I stumbled back and shouted, "I am not their biological daughter. Everyone in the village knows this. I was separated from my real parents when I was young and ended up here by accident. If you don't believe me, ask them." A tall man in a military uniform standing beside Jessica furrowed his brows and spoke in a commanding tone. "Everyone stop! Is what she's saying true?" Panic flashed across Robert's face as he quickly stepped forward. No, it's not true. She's our daughter." "It's just a matter of gaining some trust," someone muttered. Seeing the man remain silent, the village chief hesitated before stepping forward with a forced smile. "That's right. We've watched her grow up here. There was no separation. Captain you shouldn't believe the nonsense of this crazy girl." Emboldened by the village chief's words, the onlookers began nodding one after another, chiming in. "The chief is right. She's from our village. She's Jessica from the Song family. We've known for a long time that she isn't really their biological daughter. It's just that her adoptive parents treated her too harshly, and now she's lost her mind. The villagers spoke over one another, trying to cement the idea that I was delusional. As I listened to them, my gaze swept over their guilty, evasive expressions, and my heart turned cold. Ethan had even bought off the villagers? Even if I had managed to escape and speak the truth, no one would believe me? Seeing that the villagers were all denying my identity, Ethan, having recovered from the pain, seized the opportunity. "Captain Yu, I understand that you need to be cautious, but surely you can trust the words of these villagers, right? It's getting late. I really just want to meet my parents as soon as possible." The subordinate standing beside Captain Yu hesitated before leaning in and whispering, "Sir, these villagers don't seem to be lying. Maybe she really is just a crazy girl. We should hurry and take Miss Song back." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. It was clear that Captain Yu was the one making the final decision here, and judging by his expression, he wasn't fully convinced by the villagers' words. Something flashed through my mind. I suddenly stepped forward and shouted, "I am not crazy. Everything Jessica knows, she learned from Ethan, who first got that information from me. I got separated from my parents 10 years ago. I was taken by traffickers at a train station, but managed to escape when they let their guard down. It was winter at the time. I was wearing a red cotton jacket and black pants. My scarf had a North Star embroidered on it, stitched by my mother's own hands. On top of that, I had a small piece of gold and a jade pendant. The family that took me in pawned the gold, but I managed to hide the jade pendant away. If I were truly insane, would I be able to recount all of this so clearly?" I spoke quickly, recounting every detail of my disappearance. Captain Yu's expression darkened. He turned to Jessica, his gaze now filled with suspicion. "Miss Song, I looked into your background before coming here. You only recently arrived in Dayan Village? How could you possibly know all of this?" Jessica's face turned pale. Still, she forced herself to remain composed as she hastily replied, "I came here as part of the Educated Youth Program. I've been living with them ever since. I simply asked Ethan to help me look for my parents. His family knows about it. That's why he's familiar with the story." I didn't give her a chance to regain control of the situation. "But when you arrived, there were still places available in the Educated Youth Dormitory. Why didn't you stay there?" My voice was sharp, my words relentless. "You forced your way into my home instead. Every educated youth who doesn't stay in the dorm has to submit a written reason. If I recall correctly, you claimed that the dorm was too noisy and you couldn't sleep. But my house is in a much busier area than the dorm, so why were you so determined to stay with us? Captain Yu, you can easily verify this with the local records, or you can go check the dormitory yourself." Jessica's face went completely white, her hands trembling slightly. Seeing her unable to respond, Ethan quickly stepped in. Jessica only felt that the dormitory was too crowded, but she didn't want others to think she was being difficult, so she made up an excuse. No matter what, the fact remains, the jade pendant is in her hands. How can you believe someone who doesn't even have the keepsake? Ethan was going all in now. He knew that labeling Jessica as someone who sought comfort could damage her reputation, but compared to the benefits of taking my identity, a little damage to her image meant nothing. I steadied my breathing, my gaze locking onto Ethan and Jessica. "Come to think of it, Captain Yu, you still don't know my name, do you?" I spoke with deliberate calm. "My name is Allie Smith. That has always been my name. The family that took me in, Robert and Linda, have the last name Miller. They took me in because they wanted me to be a child bride for their son. That's why they never forced me to change my name." Jessica's expression twisted with unease as I continued speaking. Ethan didn't notice the slight change in Captain Yu's expression. Instead, he cut me off impatiently. "What else do you want to say now?" "Obviously, it's about the jade pendant." I looked directly at Captain Yu, my gaze unwavering. "Ethan has repeatedly claimed that the pendant wasn't in my possession and that I have no way to prove my identity. But what neither he nor Jessica knows is that if you hold this pendant under the light, you'll find a small engraving on it, a tiny Lee character." I took a step forward, my voice firm. "Lee, as in the morning star, the same symbol my mother embroidered on my scarf." My biological parents were soldiers, and their greatest wish was to see our country grow stronger. The morning star isn't just a memory of the past, it represents the generations who dedicate themselves to the future of this nation. Jessica, do you dare to show them the pendant? At my words, Jessica instinctively tightened her grip on the jade pendant and took a half step back. But Captain Yu didn't give her a chance to react. With a swift motion, he snatched the pendant from her grasp and held it up against the light, inspecting it closely. His subordinates quickly gathered around, their eyes fixed on the jade. A sharp gasp broke the silence. It's true, there really is a Lee character carved into it. The moment those words were spoken, Jessica's fraudulent identity was all but exposed. The guards nearby exchanged looks of shock, their gazes turning toward Jessica and Ethan, now filled with barely concealed disdain and reproach. Hearing this, I finally felt my heart settle. After suffering 10 years of torment in my past life, my memories had blurred, but thankfully, I had spent a lot of time examining the pendant after my rebirth and had discovered this tiny engraving. Had I known about it in my previous life, Ethan would have surely destroyed this detail, passing off any damage as an accident. I extended my hand and asked calmly, "So, can I have my pendant back now?" Jessica's face turned deathly pale. She looked toward Ethan in desperation. "Ethan?" Ethan clenched his jaw. He quickly stepped in front of Captain Yu, blocking his path as he moved to return the pendant to me. "Captain Yu, I hope you'll think this through. Who does this pendant really belong to?" Captain Yu narrowed his eyes, his tone turning cold. "Mr. Wen, what exactly do you mean by that?" His voice carried a clear warning. "This pendant isn't mine to give. It belongs to its rightful owner. And let me give you a piece of advice. If something isn't yours, don't act so generous in giving it to someone else." With that, Captain Yu moved past Ethan, about to hand me the pendant. But before he could, a deep voice suddenly called out from inside the car. "Hold it right there." A middle-aged man in a military uniform stepped out of the vehicle. The moment Captain Yu saw him, his expression grew noticeably more serious. "Mr. Wen, I assume you've heard everything that was just said?" Captain Yu's voice was steady but firm. "This pendant clearly belongs to Miss Smith. We should take her back with us." At the mention of the last name Wen, my heart instinctively tightened. I turned toward Ethan, and sure enough, upon closer inspection, I noticed a slight resemblance between him and this Mr. Wen. A sense of unease crept up my spine. I met the older man's gaze and asked, "Mr. Wen, do you still have any doubts?" Wen Jijian glanced at me briefly, then at Jessica. Without hesitation, he took the pendant from Captain Yu's hand. "No doubts," he said, his voice composed. "But names can be changed. Just because Jessica's name doesn't include Lee, doesn't mean she isn't the real daughter. Perhaps she changed her name after getting lost." At those words, Jessica's expression lit up with hope. She immediately chimed in. "Yes, that's right. I was very sick when I was little, and my name was changed afterward. This pendant belongs to me." Captain Yu's face darkened. His voice was laced with frustration. "Mr. Wen, do you realize what you're doing? We're here to find the real daughter of the Wens, not just some random girl." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. My gaze locked onto Wen Jijian. "Mr. Wen, I don't know what your connection to Ethan is, but this pendant is mine. If you insist on doing this, don't blame me for filing an official report." I had assumed Wen Jijian would at least be somewhat concerned about appearances, but instead he chuckled. "Young lady, are you threatening me?" His voice carried a hint of amusement. "Do you really think a mere report will cause me any trouble?" "I heard everything from Ethan," Wen Jijian said coolly. "You have a terrible character, behave recklessly, and even resort to violence. You threaten the very people who raised you, and now, before you've even been acknowledged by your real family, you've started making threats? How could I possibly allow someone like you to return?" Jessica, on the other hand, is well-mannered, educated, and carries herself with grace. She's clearly the better choice. I'm merely doing the commander a favor by eliminating a potential disaster ahead of time. His self-righteous words didn't just belittle me, they also painted Jessica in a superior light, as if she were the perfect daughter. Captain Yu's face darkened even more. He stepped forward, shielding me behind him, his voice rigid. "Mr. Wen, If you insist on this, don't blame me for reporting everything to the commander exactly as it happened. Wen Jijian's expression grew cold. He narrowed his eyes at Captain Yu and spoke in a dangerous tone. Captain Yu, a smart man, knows when to adapt to the situation. If I recall correctly, your younger brother is still under investigation. Are you really willing to throw away his future over some girl? At the mention of his younger brother, Captain Yu visibly hesitated. Seeing this, Wen Jijian patted him on the shoulder, his tone turning almost conciliatory. Young man, whoever becomes the commander's daughter makes no difference to you personally. But if you choose this girl, not only will your brother face consequences, but even your own career could suffer. You've spent years in the military, working diligently, enduring countless injuries. Would you really throw all of that away for a mere girl? His voice was both threatening and coaxing. And just to solidify his stance, he added, "Besides, Captain Yu, do you really think I don't have other ways to make the commander believe me? Who do you think the commander will trust more, a close confidant who has been by his side for decades, or a young officer like you?" Captain Yu's hands clenched into fists. His voice was hoarse as he asked, "Mr. Wen, I don't understand why you're so determined to make Jessica impersonate the commander's daughter. Is it really just because of your son's personal feelings, as Miss Smith claims?" His son? My heart trembled, and I instinctively turned to look at Ethan. So that was why Ethan knew so much. That was why, for 10 years in my past life, my parents never suspected a thing. The Wen family had orchestrated everything, from finding their lost daughter to keeping up the deception. Jessica's existence had never been a coincidence. Wen Jijian repeated the words as if savoring them, before letting out a short laugh. Personal feelings? A man's emotions are nothing compared to the appeal of becoming the commander's son-in-law. His gaze grew colder as he turned to me. "You should blame yourself. If only you weren't so stubborn, so unwilling to accept Ethan. How could I let the commander's daughter be someone who despises my son?" His voice was chillingly indifferent. "An unruly girl like you should just stay in this village, get married, have children, and live out your days here." He turned to Jessica. "Let's go." I lunged forward, desperate to take back my pendant, but before I could reach them, Wen Jijian's personal guards grabbed me and slammed me to the ground. "Stay put," one of them ordered, pinning me down. I struggled, but I was powerless against them. I could only watch helplessly as Jessica, her face full of triumph, followed Wen Jijian step by step toward the car. Everything from my past life flashed before my eyes: powerlessness, despair, the suffocating pain of betrayal. Was I really doomed to repeat the same fate? Had everything I'd done been for nothing? Just as I was sinking into utter despair, the roar of an engine cut through the air. A car sped toward us, kicking up dust as it came to a screeching halt. The doors flew open, and a familiar figure stepped out. Zachary. I stared at him in shock. Momentarily unable to react, he strode toward me, his movements swift and decisive. Without hesitation, he kicked the guard restraining me, sending the man sprawling to the ground. Then he reached down and pulled me up. "Are you all right?" he asked. I shook my head, still dazed. Then I blurted out, "Weren't you supposed to be back on duty? Why are you here?" Zachary patted my hand reassuringly. "You'll find out soon enough." He turned his gaze to Wen Jijian, his expression dark with displeasure. "Mr. Wen, you seem awfully bold, ordering soldiers around and coercing civilians as you please. Have you completely abandoned the law?" Wen Jijian's face stiffened. Seeing Zachary, his expression turned noticeably sour. "Zachary Shen, this is none of your business. Don't think that just because you have the Shen family behind you, you can do whatever you want." "Is that so?" Another voice, deep and authoritative, came from inside the car. The door opened. A man and a woman slowly stepped out of the car. The moment everyone saw them clearly, their faces changed drastically. The commander? And the commander's wife. I stood frozen, staring at the two figures before me, tears streaming down my face uncontrollably. I had waited 2 lifetimes for this moment. My parents, the people I had longed for, were finally standing right in front of me. My mother, Eleanor, rushed forward and pulled me into a tight embrace, her voice trembling with guilt. "Ali, my daughter, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything you've been through." She caressed my face, her touch full of heartache. When her eyes landed on the bruises and wounds on my hands, her tears fell even harder. I wrapped my arms around her, sobbing uncontrollably. "Mom, I missed you so much. I thought you didn't want me anymore." In my past life, I had watched them acknowledge another girl as their daughter. I had questioned everything. Did blood ties really mean nothing? How could they not recognize that Jessica was an imposter? Why had they never suspected her? Why hadn't they sent someone to investigate further? But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't their fault. Ethan had orchestrated everything too perfectly. No one would doubt a loyal subordinate who had been by their side for decades. No one would question a girl who could recount every detail of her past and carried the family's jade pendant. And no one would ever suspect that a supposed thief, abandoned in a remote village, was actually the long-lost daughter of a high-ranking commander. My mother kept stroking my hair, whispering apologies over and over again. Meanwhile, Wen Jijian was still trying to salvage the situation. He stepped forward and pushed Jessica toward my father. "Richard. Commander, she's your real daughter. The jade pendant matches, and so do all the details from the past. Zachary has never liked me. Don't listen to his nonsense. If you don't believe me, ask Captain Yu." He turned to Captain Yu, eyes filled with urgency, hoping for his support. But after a long silence, Captain Yu finally spoke, his voice firm. "Commander, Zachary is telling the truth. Miss Smith is your real daughter. Secretary Wen wanted his son to become your son-in-law. Since Miss Smith clearly despised Ethan, they decided to replace her with Jessica instead." Wen Jijian's expression changed drastically. "Captain Yu, do you even realize what you're saying?" Captain Yu met his gaze without hesitation. "Of course, I do, and if my brother truly made mistakes, then he should face the consequences. A soldier's duty is to protect the country and its people, not to deceive others for personal gain. Even if the commander hadn't come today, I would have reported everything upon returning to the capital. In fact, I have already submitted a report regarding my brother's case." Captain Yu's unwavering stance completely shattered Wen Jijian's last hopes. Jessica, unwilling to accept that she was losing everything, rushed toward my father, her voice pleading. "No, I'm your daughter. Not Ali. She's crazy. She's just some abandoned village girl who has been left in Dian village for years. How could she possibly be your daughter?" The guards immediately stepped forward and blocked her path. My father's expression turned solemn. "Miss Song, no parent in the world would fail to recognize their own child. She was never abandoned. Her mother and I were on a mission when our identities were exposed, leading to her being kidnapped by those who sought to use her against us. Losing her was our greatest failure as parents, but that was never her fault." Then, my father turned to Wen Jijian and Ethan, his sharp gaze like a blade. "As for everything else, I will personally investigate it once we return. The military will not tolerate deception and corruption for personal gain." With those words, Wen Jijian's fate was sealed. He took a few steps back in disbelief, then suddenly turned and struck Ethan across the face with a heavy slap. "You ungrateful fool. If you hadn't taken matters into your own hands, I wouldn't have had to clean up your mess. Do you realize what you've done? You've ruined me. You've ruined our entire family." Ethan, looking utterly lost, stared at me in a daze. My father didn't want me to be involved in what happened next. He instructed Zachary and my mother to take me back to the city immediately. On the ride back, my mother held my hand tightly, her voice soft and comforting. "Ali, we were planning to come for you ourselves. There was trouble in the military at the time, and your father and I couldn't leave," my mother said as she gently stroked my hair. "Wen Jijian took the opportunity to volunteer himself. We trusted him because of decades of camaraderie. If it weren't for Zachary gathering evidence of his deliberate deception, we never would have suspected anything. We had no idea he had set his sights on you." Her voice was filled with guilt. "It was our negligence as parents." I wiped my tears and shook my head. "It's not your fault. If anyone is to blame, it's them." Zachary, who had been watching silently from the side, sighed and tried to lighten the mood. All right, enough with the heavy talk. It'll be a long ride before we reach the city. Why don't you rest for a bit? You look like you haven't slept in ages." Feeling embarrassed, I instinctively covered my face. After everything Ethan had done, I truly hadn't had a moment of proper rest. My mother smiled, and just like when I was little, pulled me into her embrace and began humming a soft lullaby. The soothing melody slowly lulled me into sleep. In my dreams, I saw the events that had unfolded after my death in my past life. The fire had consumed me, burning me alive. Zachary had fought desperately to save me, but ultimately failed. However, in my final moments, I had clenched onto a single button, evidence of Ethan's abuse. Zachary had recognized its significance and suspected that my death was no accident. Following the lead, he began an investigation and uncovered the truth behind Ethan and Jessica's scheme to swap identities. When he presented the evidence to my parents, they had broken down in anguish. No parents would fail to recognize their own child. From the moment they first laid eyes on Jessica, they had known she wasn't their daughter. Their real daughter would never be so selfish, so full of greed. But the jade pendant and her detailed account of the past had convinced them that Ethan and Jessica knew of my existence. Fearing that Ethan and Wen Jijian would harm me, my parents had pretended to be deceived while secretly searching for me. But Wen Jian and Ethan had covered their tracks too well. 10 years passed with no trace of me. It wasn't until Zachary brought them news of my death, along with undeniable evidence, that my parents realized the daughter they had spent 20 years searching for had suffered so much, only to be brutally murdered. With that evidence, my parents uncovered even more crimes committed by the Wen family. Their guilt was irrefutable. Some were executed, others imprisoned. Ethan had tried to escape with Jessica, but in their panic, they got into a car accident. Both of them lost their legs and spent the rest of their miserable lives rotting in prison. After exacting their revenge, my parents seemed to age overnight. They resigned from their positions, returning home to grieve. They spent every day holding on to my photograph, crying until their lives withered away. A tear slid down my cheek. A voice, anxious and desperate, pulled me from my dream. Ali, wake up. I opened my eyes and was met with my mother's worried face. She immediately pulled me into her arms, her voice trembling. What's wrong? You were crying in your sleep, and no matter how much I called you, you wouldn't wake up. You scared me to death. I hugged her tightly and whispered it was just a nightmare. I had no intention of telling my parents about my past life. That pain and suffering was something I would bear alone. My mother gently patted my back. It's okay, it was just a dream. It's all over now. She took me to the hospital for a checkup, and when the doctor confirmed that I was just malnourished, she finally let out a sigh of relief. But after dreaming of my death and the events that followed, I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for things to unfold. In my past life, I had been kidnapped because Wen Jijian was the one who had leaked my parents' mission details. He had used their trust to try and eliminate them, hoping to take my father's place. I didn't need to do much. I simply mentioned a few things to my parents, subtly planting the seeds of doubt. Since they trusted me without question, they quickly investigated my words. Sure enough, they found evidence. The entire Wen family was arrested. Given the gravity of their crimes, the court wasted no time in delivering its verdict. Just like in my past life, Wen Jijian was sentenced to death. The rest of the Wen family received various prison sentences according to their crimes. As for Jessica, once her deception was exposed, her reputation was utterly ruined. Her family had always favored sons over daughters, so they quickly decided to marry her off in exchange for a bride price. No matter how much she resisted, she was ultimately forced into marriage. Later, for reasons unknown, she ended up stabbing her husband to death. She had once accused me of becoming ruthless because of the way I was mistreated as a child. Yet in the end, she was the one who turned into the very person she had falsely accused me of being. The only difference this time was that Ethan didn't try to escape with Jessica. After being imprisoned, he made only one request: to see me. Well, are you going to meet him? Zachary stood beside me, watching me closely. I looked at his serious expression and couldn't help but chuckle. Captain Shen, are you jealous? He frowned slightly, obviously displeased, but I continued teasing him. How many times do I have to tell you? Back then, I was just young and foolish. And besides, I only approached Ethan to find my parents. You should stop obsessing over this already. Zachary let out a huff of frustration, clearly dissatisfied. But after a moment, he took a small step closer to me and lowered his voice. By the way, have you heard about what happened at Qingshan Temple outside the city? I was confused. What happened? He explained. There's a legend at Qingshan Temple. Every 60 years, if a truly devoted person makes a wish and moves the heart of the Buddha, their wish will come true. The sign of this is when the temple's sacred statue darkens. I stood frozen in place, my gaze drifting toward the distant mountains. Suddenly, I remembered something from my past life. My parents had always been rational, practical people, never believing in superstition. But after avenging me, they had gone to the temple day after day, praying to the heavens for another chance, praying for me to be reborn. I swallowed hard and whispered, "Zachary." He turned to me, his expression filled with curiosity and concern. Summoning my courage, I reached for his hand and said, "Let's find a time for Grandma Shen to meet my parents. It's about time we talked about our wedding." This time around, instead of dwelling on the past, I wanted to cherish the present.